From an atheist YouTuber who got humbled by a Christian apologist, to the Christian scholar who destroys Ben Shapiro's wrong view of Jesus, these are moments when celebrities destroy atheist Hollywood, like when Piers Morgan grills astrophysicist and atheist Neil deGrasse Tyson on the existence of God.
Now, I know you're an avowed atheist. How can you be so certain that there is no supernatural, godlike entity out there, given that we know so little?
However, Neil fails to answer the question, talking about unknowns and explaining why everyone should be open-minded about the unknown.
Is there a God then, Neil deGrasse Tyson? I'll be about to have breaking news.
I don't know.
Is there a God?
Okay, so what I will tell you is that there are a lot of unknowns in the universe, but just because there are unknowns does not mean there's a deity in the unknown. If you're going to assign a deity to that which... It doesn't mean there isn't, that's correct.
So you're more of an open mind about this, right?
Everyone should. If the unknown is the unknown. But the track record of people saying, God is behind this, and then you add a little science to it and you find out, no, we can completely explain it.
While Piers cuts right to the chase, wanting to know whether there is a God or not, agnostic YouTuber Alex O'Connor asks Oxford mathematician Professor John Lennox a more complicated question.
I'm also not on the boat of saying that God doesn't exist and religion is false. I'm more of an agnostic these days, but I tend to take a more critical tone because that's just sort of who I am and what I do. But I think I remain quite thoroughly agnostic, which is one of the reasons it's quite difficult to interrogate my beliefs, because there are so few of them that are solidly held. But one of them would be, for example, so there's the reliability of scripture, but when you're talking about theism as opposed to Christianity, one of them really is the problem of evil. I do find it mysterious.
Instead of defending his beliefs blindly, Professor John Lennox reframes the question and calmly explains the problem of evil and suffering to Alex.
And we can argue as long as we like about the theoretical side, if God is good and all-powerful, why this, why that, why the other? And we never come to a satisfactory answer. The God presented in the Christian Gospels is a God who in that sense has suffered, because the central claim of Christianity is that God became human and that Christ is God. So, crudely put, what is God doing on a cross? Well, one thing it certainly shows me is that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has become part of it.
Unlike Professor Lennox, Jordan Peterson, who is also a professor, went all out, this time in a high-profile exchange with American activist Matt Dillahunty, where he didn't shy away from the tough question. Matt goes straight to the point, admitting that he doesn't believe there is a God, which leads Jordan to explain the role that culture plays.
I've become convinced that the fundamental presuppositions of our very functional cultures, or Western cultures say, are nested immovably in a metaphorical substrate, and that when you enter that metaphorical substrate, you're in the domain of religious phenomenology. And I think that not only can you derive that conclusion as a consequence of deep philosophical thought and literary analysis, but that if you know enough about brain function, you'll also come to the same conclusion.
Before identifying the role evolutionary biology plays in the topic,
I think you come to the same conclusion as well if you look at the evolution of religious cognition from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist and not from the position of a evolutionary biologist whose head is addled by the belief that most of human morality was established in the 500 years since the Enlightenment. So that's a start, I guess.
However, Matt notes that this only concerns personal religious identity, not whether God exists or if there's sufficient reason to believe in God. And while he acknowledges that people can derive values from their beliefs, he's concerned about those who believe they have good reason to believe in God's existence.
For me, I have no problem acknowledging that people derive value from their beliefs, whether or not they map to anything in reality. That they can be inspired and motivated, educated, and enlightened by poetry, prose, metaphor, allegory. But my concern is, having grown up a fundamentalist Southern Baptist, the people who I know and some of the people who are working to enact legislation on behalf of their beliefs are convinced that they have good reason to believe that there actually is a God, not just that it's useful to them.
Jordan addresses this, basically saying that atheist thinking comes with the illusion that the Bible has to be scientifically correct.
I have a fair bit of respect for the atheist types because they spend a lot of time thinking, and that's generally a good thing. You know, I see most of their thinking, however, directed at the fundamentalist types, the fundamentalist Christian types, mostly of the American persuasion, who suffer from the somewhat understandable illusion that the biblical corpus has the same epistemological and ontological status as a scientific theory, when it clearly doesn't, right? I mean, if you're
Okay, now we're closer to the same page.
Okay,
Yeah.
if you're a religious thinker, let's say, if you're a serious student of religious thought and a serious philosopher, one of the things you can't claim is that whatever story the Bible is telling is a scientific theory.
When it comes to the Bible, Bill Maher doesn't care about it being scientifically correct. To him, it's just another long and boring book, and he made that known in a conversation with Alan Richson. During the conversation, Bill Maher claims that many Christians do not know their own religion because they do not read the Bible.
Know their own religion. They haven't read the Bible. They talk about the Bible a lot. It's a long book. Some of it's boring.
Surprisingly, Alan did not disagree with Bill, but he points out a problem with most Christians today and expresses his own view of Christianity.
The problem that I have with most Christians today, and I talk about this openly a lot, is that it misses the point. I mean, you can get hung up in the weeds about document Q or whatever you want to talk about with where this stuff comes from, but the point is very simple. You've got somebody who claims to be the Messiah pointing the way towards a whole radically different new way to love, and that's through self-sacrificial care of your neighbor.
Very true.
And when you talk about just that, it's a really beautiful thing that a lot of other religions don't talk about.
Bill agrees with Alan's view of what Christianity should look like, but he still doesn't believe God exists. And Alan's reply is absolute gold.
I'm totally down with that.
That's it.
Yeah, I just don't think he's God. I don't think there's such a thing as a God.
I guess we'll find out.
Yeah.
I guess we'll find out.
Well,
rock on. Like, I do. I'll name it, but
well, that's kind of.
But I know that's not for everybody.
For people who consider the Bible too long and boring, the television series The Chosen does a good job of making it more interesting. Jonathan Rumi, who portrays Jesus Christ in the series, talks to an atheist about how playing the role has changed his life.
McDevitt says, Jonathan, have you experienced more escalated levels of spiritual warfare the longer you've been in this unique role? What are some of the ways you fight spiritual attacks?
Like Jesus Christ, Jonathan Rumi has literally carried the weight of the cross to some extent, and he explains how he faces the attacks and challenges that comes with the role.
Any and all spiritual attacks with prayer, with the Rosary, Divine Mercy, the Angelus, all of those. And, I feel like I've become more hyper aware of spiritual warfare, and I've probably sensed more attacks. I haven't been struck by lightning, praise Jesus, at this point.
That did happen, didn't it?
Happened to Jim, yeah, while he was on the cross. So I'm praying that doesn't happen.
The commitment to portray Jesus is not an easy one, and Jonathan shares the physical toll it takes on his body.
I was sitting in the hair and makeup chair, and next thing I know, like I get these massive pains, like just shooting up into my ear, and I'm like, it's just anxiety. It's like, at one point I had heart palpitations. I'm like, okay, I don't know what's happening, but I'm just, and I texted my spiritual director, who was in the other room, and he's like, I'm saying a rosary for you right now. And in 15 minutes, it all went away and everything was fine. But I think kind of speaking to what the sort of attacks and things like that, I think the spiritual attacks kind of manifest themselves in so many different kinds of ways. Maybe that's some of it. Maybe that's just physical anxiety. Maybe that's just me trying to do the best I can and not, ruin it for Jesus. So.
The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ remain central to Christian faith and continue to generate thoughtful discussion. On the Joe Rogan Experience, Wesley Huff, a Canadian theologian, shows proof of God's existence with historical evidence of Jesus' resurrection. It starts with Joe Rogan asking Wesley for his take on the resurrection story.
So what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? What do you think happened? Do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
To answer Joe's question, Wesley turns to historical evidence.
As a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
In response, Joe points out the amount of time that has passed from that event till now, and also the fact that the literacy of the population back then is quite different compared to today.
It's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024, trying to figure it at the end of 2024, trying to figure this out, literally the end.
Yeah.
Last couple of days. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
Joe argues that, logically, even with modern medicine, people don't come back to life after 3 days. However, Wesley responds by highlighting the profound mysteries of the universe that cannot be ignored or put aside.
But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on. For. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things.
He argues that people at the time witnessed the resurrection and documented it, but Joe presses him on how anyone can be certain it's actually true.
Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. I mean, if we read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote these both documents, he says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after he was resurrected from the dead. And so these are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus's ministry, who were there, say, at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said.
Truths stand the test of time, and Wesley points out that the fact Jesus' resurrection story has stood the test of time compared to all other messianic figures is proof of his divinity.
Because Jesus wasn't the only messianic figure who arose and claimed to be the Messiah.
Right.
There were a number of individuals both prior to and after Jesus, but they die and the movement dies with them.
While Wesley Huff believes in the divinity of Christ because he died and was resurrected, Ben Shapiro has a very different view.
You know, from a Jewish point of view, where we don't believe in the divinity of Christ, I think that there you can make an argument that the Gospels, which were written,
he was just a prophet.
No, we don't even believe he was a prophet.
What do you think he was? What do you guys think?
What do I think he was historically? I think he was a Jew who tried to lead a revolt against the Romans and got killed for his trouble, just like a lot of other Jews at that time who were crucified for trying to lead revolts against the Roman and got killed.
In an interview with Christian scholar Dr. William Lane Craig, Ben asks for proof of Jesus Christ's divinity.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the gospel?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets. And finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority.
Using Jesus' words, Dr. William schools Ben, explaining how Jesus himself uses the scriptures as proof of his divinity during his trial.
So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand."
Then he corrects Ben's claims that Jesus was just another Jew who led a revolt against Romans, explaining how the Sanhedrin used Jesus' words against him.
And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
Ben argues from the Jewish perspective that Dr. Williams' narrative is full of holes.
The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense even. There are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures. The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe.
He explains that in Judaism, the Messiah has traditionally been seen as a political figure, but when Jesus declared himself the Messiah, he meant something else.
Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that'd be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
Dr. William agrees, noting that Jesus' unique understanding of the term Messiah is what ultimately led to his crucifixion. However, he goes further, presenting a stronger case for why Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah should be accepted over the traditional Jewish view.
Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead.
According to Dr. William, Jesus' resurrection is enough proof of his divinity.
Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be.
Not backing down, Ben wanted to know why the resurrection is proof of divinity, and he makes an example of another character in the Bible who was also resurrected.
When it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection.
In response, Dr. William points out the differences between the resurrection of Jesus Christ and that of Lazarus.
A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
While Dr. William points to the resurrection as evidence of Jesus' divinity, on the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe Rogan and Mel Gibson discuss possible physical evidence that could support the historical reality of Jesus' life and death.
I mean, just recently they verified the Shroud of Turin. Have you seen that?
I've been reading about it, and I know that there's some contention, there's some discussion and debate about it, but they used to think that it was only a couple hundred years old.
Yeah.
And now they've changed that.
Yeah, they said no, it's back then.
They also don't understand how it was made, which to me is very fascinating because it's not paint. It's not, they don't know what caused the image itself and how that technology would have even been available.
It wasn't. No.
A couple thousand years ago.
An intense light, I mean atomic, to leave almost like a photographic imprint on a piece of cloth.
Joe and Mel talk about the recently discovered Shroud of Turin, which bears a faint image that depicts a Hebrew man believed to be Jesus Christ.
It depicts a first century Hebrew male because the hairstyle was from the first century, and a Hebrew hairstyle, that he was about 6 feet tall, that he was completely scourged all over his body. He was crucified.
Mel highlights specific features on the Shroud of Turin, along with other details, which he believes serve as evidence that it was the very burial cloth used for Jesus Christ after his crucifixion.
Yeah. Scourged, beaten, the wounds on the thorns, the hands, the feet, and the scourging. And the hairstyle was from the first century. And the pollens that they found in the cloth were from that region.
Yeah.
Also, the weave was a first century weave. That was typical.
Mel also talks about the presence of unique marks on the image on the shroud, which according to him, places it in the same historical period in which Jesus lived and died.
Another guy, an archaeologist who I knew who actually translated the Passion into Aramaic, told me that if you look close, you can see the image of a Tiberius coin marks on the eyes. Now, I don't know if that's real or not. I've never actually checked that, but that there's images of Tiberius on the coin.
So they would put the coins over the eyes?
Yeah. So that would date it. But they have now verified that it does actually go back to that time period. For a while, they were testing pieces that had been repaired in the 13th century.
Joe wants to know whether artifacts like the Shroud of Turin is definite proof that Jesus must have existed.
Like, what are you saying? You're saying that this is really the shroud that Jesus was covered in? So you're saying Jesus historically absolutely did exist, and we think that this is the shroud that covered him. That alone, people, incredulity, people's immediately their hackles raise. Like, wait a minute, and they just instead of like looking at it objectively, they almost always want to look at it from a point of view of disproving it immediately, dismissing it immediately.
But that's that's science, isn't it? You have to sort of
And he refers to reports of another well-known artifact from the Bible that is allegedly located in Ethiopia.
And that they believe the Ark of the Covenant is in this one church that's protected by all these monks that wind up getting cataracts and radiation disease and sickness. And they think that it's because they're protecting this Ark of the Covenant, this actual thing, that it's an actual physical thing that's there.
And if you touch it, you get zapped.
Yeah, and that even being in its presence fucks these people up.
Maybe. Who knows? I mean, it's got to be someplace, right? They buried it. They lost track of it.
Mel theorizes that artifacts like the Ark of the Covenant may hold even more evidence supporting the events described in the Bible, suggesting that, for him, such discoveries leave little room to doubt the existence of God and Jesus Christ.
And all the stories are, if you even touched it, you fall over, because it was constructed electrically somehow.
Yeah, like, what is that? What's in there? Why is it giving people cancer if they're really protecting it?
I think it's the actual structure of the container it's in that is the problem. That's my thought on it. I could be wrong. But I think inside it, they have things from like when Moses was like manna and, stuff like that they managed to keep from